Hi guys, I've got the new release of the Dappled Appellation Chardonnay. So this is the 2024, and when I first tried this, I thought, wow, this Chardonnay really punches above its weight. And all the decisions that winemaker is making, so Shaun the winemaker, it really comes through in the glass. And so I want to talk you through that because they're essentially, for me, two really clear types of Chardonnay, ones that go through malolactic fermentation that have those nice buttery notes, and ones that don't, that have more of a crisp acid line. I love both. This one has a little bit of malolactic fermentation, but it doesn't always. And I want to talk you through that. But first, let's kick off with where it all starts for me, which is the wild ferment. What I mean by that is when we're making alcohol, we're obviously converting yeast and sugar to make that alcohol. The sugar is always naturally occurring in the grape. The yeast can either be commercial, so kind of like store-bought, versus wild or ambient. So yeast that's naturally occurring on the grape in the vineyard, and this one is that ambient wild yeast. Now what that means is, because it's natural, you can't necessarily control what it's going to be like every single year. So there's a little bit of vintage to vintage differences that can come through, and I quite like that, because I think it also shows how well winemakers are to balance and get so much consistency year to year, particularly when they're using something wild and naturally occurring. And that to me also lets you really understand the terroir, the vintage, the environment. I think it's great. So that's tick number one for me. The next thing is the fact that there's a combination of old and new oak. So whenever I hear oak, I know that there's going to be more flavor, because we're getting that interaction with oxygen, which is going to change the flavor profile. Essentially what happens with a bottle that's aging in the cellar. So a combination of old and new oak also means that we're going to have different levels of that oak influence that's going to come through. So I'm looking for smoke, cedar, vanilla, things like that. I love that because I love just a little bit extra in that complexity and flavor profile. The other thing that I really like is aging on lees. So going back to the fermentation, we're fermenting yeast, sugar to make alcohol. That yeast through that process dies and it becomes what we call lees, which is basically dead yeast. There's two different types of lees. So you've got your gross lees that sink to the bottom, think of it as heavy sediment, and your fine lees, which are like little particles that kind of float around in the wine and also integrate some of their flavors. So it's a process called yeast autolysis. That's what gives it that nice biscuity, toasty flavor profile. And I love that. And one of the other things that's really interesting is there's no temperature control while that process is taking place, so aging on the lees, which means that if the temperature happens to become warm enough, it means that the wine will naturally go through a process called malolactic fermentation, which basically converts the malic acid, which is what we find in apples, so that crisp acidity, into lactic acid, which is what we find in milk, which brings down that acid, so softens it a bit, and also brings out those buttery notes, which I also love. But because it's not actively encouraged, it's a vintage to vintage variation, and this one has gone through that a little bit, and I love it. This for me really ticks so many boxes. It's beautifully balanced. Oh, you've got those stone fruits, the toast, the butteriness, the citrus that comes through. It's just beautiful. Such a beautiful wine. You're getting everything on the palate that you're smelling. You've got that really nice pink grapefruit, that sharp acidity that comes through, but still that nice little bit of creaminess, butter, the toast. It's beautifully balanced, the combination of that acid and creaminess. It is seriously such a good wine, especially for the price point. Cheers.